I'll introduce myself, Lincoln Frasca, and I'm a conservation planning specialist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And I'm joined by Jens Hilke, conservation biologist, and he'll be taking over on the second half of this presentation entitled Knowing Your Options and Choosing the Right Tools for Your Town. We're excited to share a variety of different conservation strategies with you today, so let's jump in. So the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department's mission is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And Jens and I make up the Community Wildlife Program. So we offer a variety of free services to towns and regional planning commissions, as well as other conservation groups. And we're here to support your conservation planning goals. We do presentations and trainings like these virtually and also in person. And we can connect you with statewide resources and regional planning commissions or other Vermont communities. And we also help understand the science behind land use planning, so we can assist in the mapping of your town's natural resources, as well as interpreting resources that you need to make informed decisions. Just a few notes about Microsoft Teams here. Please keep yourself muted to cut down the background noise. And we are recording this presentation. If you don't mind at this time, typing your name and your town or organization into the chat. And feel free to ask questions via the chat as well. And we're going to break several times throughout the presentation to answer those questions. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about why we plan and how to get started. And then we're going to jump into non-regulatory strategies, regulatory tools, as well as finishing off with implementation and getting things going. So why do we plan? Well, the main reason we want to plan is to preserve the unique feel of our community and its historical character and prepare our town for future growth. So every community is unique, and what we have here is a snapshot of the historical infrastructure of Tunbridge Village. So this picture shows buildings and developments from the late 1700s to the late 1900s. And I'll just point out, circled here, Potash Road, that was built in 1780s and then paved in 1975. And I just thought this was an interesting way to show how slow development sometimes happens in Vermont. And if you have a downtown or village center, this is a great place for you to get to know as a planning leader. This is probably the location you'll be meeting folks and engaging them in the planning process. So another reason we plan is for our community values. Boating, hunting, biking, birding, running. These are just a few of the recreational activities that are a way of life for so many Vermonters. And we want to feel connected to the place that we live. And so many of us form communities around these activities. I'm in Montpelier, and maybe you've been to Hubbard Park, but that's where I like to go to kind of escape. And even if I can't make it there, I just like knowing that it's there, that it exists. And community values are really at the heart of planning. And before you can even begin planning, you need to identify what these values are in your community. Another big reason we plan is to protect natural resources. So Vermonters value forests, and I'm just going to list some of those reasons that we value them and what large intact forests provide for us. So there's undeveloped landscapes and a rural character. Forests are places for recreation. They provide us with clean air and water, erosion prevention, carbon sequestration. Large forests will transmit fewer tick-borne illnesses. They produce timber, as well as support biodiversity. And that's the mix of wildlife and plants that rely on forest habitats. So biodiversity is essential to the healthy functioning and sustainability of our ecosystems. And it's important to consider what is threatening biodiversity or biological diversity. And today, it's habitat loss. That's the #1 threat to biodiversity in Vermont. And there's 3 main types of habitat loss we're going to talk about. There's degradation, which is pollution or invasive species, things that will prevent ecosystems from functioning naturally and healthy. Then there's conversion, which is completely changing a landscape into a new use or development, such as paving or something that just completely transforms the landscape. And there's fragmentation. which is when larger forest patches are divided into smaller patches and are isolated from one another. And we're going to talk a little bit more about fragmentation and what that impacts. So most of what we value about our forests are impacted when they become fragmented. Wildlife and their habitat can be limited or polluted, sometimes erased altogether for larger ranging animals. Working forests, they're less productive in a smaller patch. Recreational access can be reduced or cut off by smaller patches or private property. Invasive species are likely to take over after disturbances and on forest edges, often outcompeting natives. So flooding and damages increase with the removal of trees. You get a decrease of bank stabilization, increase in flood damages. And then you also see more tick-borne illnesses because the host of ticks, mice and deer, they do a lot better in a small patch when there are less predators. And of course, a reduction of air quality and less trees mean less CO2 being absorbed and less oxygen produced. Okay, so it's really a community effort to plan in a way that prevents forest fragmentation and preserves our valued natural resources. This is the community capital pyramid, and it's a way to show how planning for infrastructure, community values, and natural resources are interconnected. The pyramid illustrates how built capital at the very top is a product of the human and social capital in the middle, and social capital ultimately relying on a foundation of the natural capital down there at the bottom, those natural resources, the ecosystem services, and some more intrinsic values like the beauty of nature. So we need healthy ecosystems to keep this pyramid standing. And when we plan for natural resources, we're really in turn planning for a more sustainable place for people and our economies to thrive. And you could fill in this pyramid with the places and people in your community, and that's a great planning exercise that you might consider. Okay, and we have to remember the bigger picture when we're planning, because ultimately we have to balance the health of our forests with the health of our economy and of our community. And the best tools that we're going to go over today for land use planning will address this balance and positively impact the whole community. Okay, so that was why we planned. Are there any questions at this time, Jens, from the chat that we can answer?
Lincoln, there's nothing in the chat at this time, but folks, please do write questions in the chat while he's going. We'll have an opportunity to unmute your mics at the end, Betsy. We'll just hold on those for now. But
I just can't see the chat.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes Teams can be a fickle beast, and sometimes the chat doesn't display, and we have no idea why.
Me too. I don't have any.
I second that.
Yeah,
wow.
I've been looking and looking and looking. I can't figure out how to turn it on.
Huh, that's curious. Anyway, my apologies. Does anyone want to ask a question? You can unmute your mic. Patty Davis, go ahead.
Can I take screenshots of like that pyramid? I'm on the planning commission, so this is very helpful. And
you sure can take screenshots, and I can also just send you a PDF of the slideshow if you just email us.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. I've been talking back and forth with Lincoln, so
yeah, we're happy to give you the PDF.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any other questions at this time? All right. And folks with your hands up, would you please also lower those? Thanks so much. Awesome. Well, I apologize about the chat thing, but we'll try and figure that out. Teams is really giving us a hard time. Lincoln, please go ahead.
All right. So we're gonna get started here into the actual planning itself. So where do we start? And before considering what planning tools are right for your community, you have to be deliberate and clear about what you are actually trying to fix. And when we prepare to plan, you also have to consider the timing in your community. What's the political climate like? Is this the right time to take on a new project? Does your town have the capacity? And then once you've decided on a problem and you've identified something that you do want to fix, it's time to gather people, a diverse group of stakeholders that are going to be interested or potentially impacted by this problem. And the more people, the better here, because what you're trying to achieve is a consensus on the problem statement. Okay, you're not at the point where you're talking about solutions. All you want to focus on is agreeing on what it is you're trying to fix. And I'm going to use the Hartford's town plan process as an example here. They do a really good job of getting consensus on their problem statements. And during a town plan rewrite, Hartford decided to look at their growing population, and they identified that there was significant development pressure threatening the rural character of their town. So they formed a steering committee, and the steering committee wasn't just a planning commission. It consisted of members from the Conservation Commission, the select board members, school board and historical society representatives, finance and chamber of commerce peoples, landowners, and members of the housing authority. So they got a big diverse crew together, and that committee held public visioning sessions in 5 different locations through town. And in every session, residents agreed that they value the rural character of their town. And Hartford creates a steering committee every time they rewrite their town plan, and they meet people where they're at and they make it easy for them to engage in the planning process. So really good example of how you can get a whole bunch of people together and hopefully try to agree on what you're trying to fix. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the tools. We talked about identifying the problem and gathering stakeholders and agreeing on what we're trying to fix. And now when we talk about the tools, we're really talking about the strategies and actions for achieving our natural resource goals. So we have non-regulatory tools. These are things like education, outreach to landowners, as well as conservation. And then the other bucket is regulatory tools. And this includes zoning or subdivision regulations, and they can be used by towns to require that land is managed in a specific way. And one thing to note here is that with regulatory tools, it's not always you can or you can't when it comes to development, but often these are the things that are guiding the way development happens. For instance, construction near an important natural resource might be sited or have different site design requirements with regulatory options. So the particular tools you choose will reflect the balance that makes sense locally. And usually it's a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory tools that works best. But the level of complexity and the particular tools you choose will depend on your specific community. So regardless of the tools that you choose, outreach, connection, education, that's really the foundation of this non-regulatory approach. And as we saw in the Hartford planning process, it's essential for setting the stage for any planning initiative. Okay, for each possible tool or strategy you do choose, it's important to evaluate how well it will work before implementing. So it's worth asking your committee, does it help does this tool actually help the problem statement? Does it align with community values? And if so, there's going to be more support from the public. And how much local capacity is required? How much effort will it take? And is this the right time? What will this strategy cost? And are there funding sources that you already know of? And who else can help? Are there people that are available and on board to help? Local businesses, recreation groups, could be faith groups, schools. Those are just a few parties that might be interested, but you got to think outside the box to sometimes find partners. Okay, and a great way to evaluate your options is by using this matrix of tools. And the criteria in the top row are the same as the questions from the previous slide, but now we're just looking at all the different possible tools and we can compare them together. And you want to think of the tools rated as low in the does it help the problem column, such as outreach and education, as really prerequisites for regulatory options like zoning and subdivision. Because regulatory tools are much more likely to pass and be successful if people understand and support them. And notice that the same non-regulatory tools, they build on existing efforts, and they're going to always align with community values. All right, we have another opportunity for questions here. If Jens, maybe you can field these, and yeah, we'll take them live because the chat's down, or maybe the chat's back up.
I doubt the chat's back up. Anyone have any questions? You want to unmute your mic? Feel free to ask. Go ahead, please.
So Hartford, you mentioned Hartford's strategy of the steering committee. How long does that take between conception and then going through all that consensus building and evaluation before it might land into the plan? How much runway do you typically need?
That is an excellent question. And I, for the Hartford example, actually, to be honest, I don't know the timeline on that. And I'll defer to Jens, who probably knows that case study a little bit better than myself.
You know, typically a town will allow for a year or more to rewrite their town plan. And, you know, the Regional Planning Commission will often help the town go through chapter by chapter. So it can be a year and a half. But it's kind of a similar time frame, whether it's just the Planning Commission or whether it's the Planning Commission and a steering committee. It doesn't take that long to bring in additional people. Maybe an extra month or so, but not much more. Any other questions out there? All right, Lincoln, let's look at non-regulatory tools.
Non-regulatory tools coming up. So what are these strategies? We have outreach and education, which is the overarching strategy that I've mentioned. And that's when we're celebrating the place that we live in and doing different presentations in our community or hosting events like potlucks, could be art contests or concerts even. You want to drum up support for the planning process, get people excited. Acquiring land and conservation easements are another regulatory strategy. Sorry, non-regulatory. And towns who have reserve funds for purchase of conserved lands, they don't need to vote on acquiring those conserved lands. They can just do it because the funds are already in reserve for that purpose. The Planning Commission can also recommend that willing landowners consider working with a land trust and doing an easement of some sort. We have the use value appraisal or current use program, which is a state program that can lead to significant tax breaks for eligible forest and farm landowners. And the town can also encourage private participation in this program. And we have estate planning, which is it's a conversation between generations. And this is important because by 2030, we're looking at a quarter of Vermonters are going to be 65 years or older. And it's important to address the question of how will land be passed on and how can we prevent land from being fragmented? And the Planning Commission can also play a role in encouraging landowners to engage in estate planning. And then we have mapping natural resources. This could be a community effort or a hired environmental consultant could come in and do something. But this is going to highlight unique natural communities in your town and allow your town to see its natural resources and how they connect to neighboring communities. We have town forests. This could be something you decide to establish to model sustainable forestry practices and great places for recreation. And then last but not least, there's the town plan, which is the foundation for planning and can really encourage all of these non-regulatory strategies on the town scale and sets you up for regulatory strategies. So we're gonna talk more about the town plan right now. This is a visionary document for what your town is going to look like and the projects that you will take on in the next 8 years. So the town plan is the critical first step in identifying and mapping important natural resources, setting those priorities, and recommending strategies for conservation of forest lands. The basis for all land regulation, that is what the town plan really is. The town plan isn't regulatory by itself, but it can influence the Act 250 process, which states projects subject to review must be in conformance with the local and regional plan policies. So for an example, I'm going to use Newfane's town plan from July 2018. This is a copy of Newfane's natural resource map, and it highlights conserved land, agricultural areas, deer wintering habitats, as well as wetlands. And they have a very clear forest resource policy, which outlines the need to avoid fragmentation of large forest blocks and maintain habitat connectivity. And follow that is a forest resource recommendation, which calls for land use regulations that promote clustered development outside of forest blocks in order to protect locally significant forest lands. And this kind of detailed mapping and clear writing and prioritization of healthy forest blocks makes for a really strong town plan that aligns with community values. Okay, the next strategy we're going to talk about more in depth is the UVA current use program. So statewide program, and it allows eligible landowners who are practicing long-term forestry or agriculture to have their land appraised based on the property's value of production of wood or food, rather than its residential or commercial development value. So what does this do? It reduces pressure to develop. It's a tax incentive for eligible landowners. Nonprofits or towns can be a part of this. It can prevent subdivision or conversion of forest. And then towns are also reimbursed annually. So enrollment in UVA doesn't affect your town's tax revenue. And already more than 50% of eligible forest land in Vermont is enrolled, and 70% of eligible farmland is enrolled. So Jens, if you don't mind putting that link for the UVA webpage in the chat, well, that's not help, but maybe we'll just add this following the presentation and a follow-up message to you all, because all this information is on Vermont State's website, and you can learn more about eligibility and details there. So let's look at town forests. One more example here of non-regulatory strategies. And when a town establishes a town forest, its residents gain access to all those benefits of undeveloped land that we were highlighting earlier. And the town forest can actually be located in or outside of municipal boundaries. So some of the reasons a town might decide to do a forest is they want to protect the water sources in their town, or they want to practice forestry and grow timber, maybe be a model for sustainable forestry, provide wildlife habitat, have access to those recreation opportunities, and have a community rallying place. This is a town forest could be an excellent place to hold these events or concerts, potlucks, and things like that. So for an example here, I have a map of Randolph's Sayward Town Forest. And this is a really neat example of like a homegrown initiative that was led by this resident, Steve Springer. And he noticed that a lot of the town forests in Randolph were being used primarily for lumber, but they had this major recreation potential. So he revived Randolph's Forest Committee, and they developed a recreation management plan. And Randolph is now a huge public mountain bike destination, and they partner it with all kinds of interest groups. Okay, to wrap up non-regulatory strategies, let's just go over the benefits of them. So first and foremost, they're going to align with community values. The community interests are at the heart of successful non-regulatory strategies. These tools are going to build place-based connections. And when we connect people to the place they live and they care about, they're going to want to be involved in that planning process. We can build trust between planners and residents and minimize that, us versus them culture that can sometimes creep up in the planning process. There's the possibility for multi-town involvement. And finally, we're setting the stage for those regulatory strategies, and especially the town plan, which is that foundational piece. Okay, before I pass it over to Jens here and he goes into regulatory tools, are there any questions? Jens, I'm gonna.
Betsy, go ahead.
Okay.
My question is, for the current use, is there a certain amount of land you have to qualify for that?
There it
27
is. acres. There it is. 27
Pardon me?
acres.
27 acres. It's two acres for the building envelope and then 25 for the parcel itself.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Here's one for you all. When I post something in the chat, can you see it, or does like chat just not exist for you? Okay. Wow. Gosh. All right. This really upsets me. But anyway, I'm so sorry about that, folks. All right. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get into some of those regulatory strategies. Whoa. Let me just try that again. Maybe this time on the correct slide. All right. So can you all see my screen?
Looks good, Jens.
Great, thanks. I can't see you, so I just need an audio. All right, great. So thanks so much. Lincoln just introduced those non-regulatory strategies. He started out by going through this process of sort of first agreeing on the problem and bringing as big a group together as you can and agree on the problem, and then work to develop that problem statement and then create that sort of matrix of different options. And so now we just went through those non-regulatory options. We're going to go through the regulatory options first, and then we're going to pick back up with that step-by-step process. So here we are in the regulatory arena, and the first tool that I wanted to talk about are zoning bylaws. And so in zoning, and 86% of Vermont towns already have zoning. And here, each district in your zoning would have a clear purpose statement. The zoning bylaws define what land uses are allowed in each district. And so each district has a clear purpose statement, and then you can use zoning to control what happens in those different districts and how the uses relate to one another. The next tool is subdivision regs, and those really help you guide the pattern of development in a different way. Subdivision regulations regulate the overall pattern of development, including how land is divided up and where the development is located on your parcel. And this can help minimize open space fragmentation. So you can see this image on the right, and there are really two different parcels here. And the parcel on the left, they've really maximized driveway length. There's a large building envelope, that clearing, large envelope. But you could also set the standards to have shorter driveways and shorter building envelopes. Okay. So then the next tool I want to introduce here. Oh, and I'll just say this, that, from my standpoint, subdivision may offer the best bang for your buck. We'll come back around to subdivision, but I really think there's a lot there. The next tool is overlay districts. And the overlay district is a resource-based district. It allows you to draw lines on top of the regular zoning districts and then add standards to those. And so that's a way of protecting those highest priority natural resources that cut across other zoning districts. Okay, planned unit development, or PUDs. And so that allows for flexibility in applications for development. You could mix residential and commercial buildings, but then it would promote cluster development with a density bonus, and then there'd be a part of the parcel that was set aside for conservation. So you would have a higher density in one portion of the parcel, and then another portion of the parcel set aside for conservation. So conditional use, and here I'm really talking about within the zoning bylaw, is you can set whether a certain use is permitted. And so in each zoning district, there are conditional uses, and those get a higher level of review versus an approved use. And that would just go straight to the zoning administrator and be a much easier application, whereas a conditional use would likely go to the development review board or the zoning board of adjustment. And so then the next one is site plan review. And here, this could be used to minimize the effect of larger residential and commercial development on the site. It looks at building sites, access, parking, landscaping. You can really use site plan review in a variety of different ways. And it can also include standards to preserve or protect important elements or features identified on the site. So like, including significant natural resources such as rare forest communities, wetlands, or endangered species. So you could use site plan review as a way of looking in the confines of the parcel. Okay, so I just want to pick up on a couple of these. And first, I'll just show you an example of a new zoning rewrite in Bolton that was just done. So in 2018, Bolton began updating their zoning bylaws with the goal of limiting sprawl and increasing wildlife connectivity. So here's the old zoning code. And let me just orient you here. I'm going to turn on my laser pointer. And so you can see that the green is the forest district and the yellow is the conservation district. And then this stipple is their rural residential district. Now, rural residential districts is where the overwhelming growth is happening in Vermont. Regrettably, we're not really growing in our villages, our downtowns, or even our growth centers. Most of the development is happening in these rural residential districts. And part of the problem here is that's kind of the Vermont brand, right? Is, move to Vermont, live at the end of your own long driveway, 40 acres and a mule, that kind of thing. And so that rural residential district is the Vermont brand. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of our development. And that's also where accounting for sprawl. And so we tend to have looser standards in these rural residential districts, but higher standards in a in a forest or conservation district. So this 2005 zoning map really shows that it's zoned for sprawl. I'm just pointing out the highway I-89. And so this is really a recipe for sprawl along Route 2 and the interstate here, and then along some of these north-south roads. So the new district, there are a couple things here. You'll see there's a lot more of the conservation district. So they expanded the district boundaries. That's part of it. And really, there have been a lot of Act 250 proceedings in Bolton associated with Bolton Valley and Bolton Valley Resort and other areas. So it looks like there's a really substantial increase in the conservation district. But really what happened is they went through the deeds for all these various parcels and realized there were already deed restrictions, meaning development wasn't going to happen on those parcels. So they said, let's just call a spade and put them in our conservation district because they're not able to be developed anyway. But they did expand the districts a little bit. And in particular, I wanted to point out this area where they brought the forest district all the way down to the highway. And that actually connects up with conserved land in Duxbury on the other side of the river and the highway. So they met with all of the landowners that were affected, and they were already in use value appraisal, the current use program. And so it didn't really create a big stir. but the pattern is radically different. It allows for wildlife movement north and south across this major barrier in Vermont. And so that's a way that you can use zoning to protect connectivity and to limit sprawl. Okay, so I had mentioned subdivision standards, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more. You know, like zoning, subdivision bylaws can include design guidelines or standards to promote conservation of various resources. And so this can guide the pattern of development. So the standard is a way to avoid a layout that we see frequently along our roads where houses and driveways cut across open fields or cut across, you know, or fragment forests. In the example on screen, you know, they're really trying to protect the open ag lands, the open areas. I might, in another drawing, I might show this same thing with forested area, and where they're really, you know, putting the houses way back inside the forest. And so the layout at right here consolidates those driveways and it tucks them into the woods. So if your goal is to preserve that open space, you know, this is a better pattern, whereas this is wasteful of that resource. So another standard illustrated here at right is the use of the shared driveway. And in some communities, you know, that's a non-starter. I worked with a group of realtors up in the Northeast Kingdom, and they said, you know, people who work with their clients don't move to the kingdom to share a driveway. And I hear that, but it also, you know, you can have privacy and still have a shared driveway. So I do think there's some things to take from using subdivision as a way of protecting habitat. And so these standards could also address other resource impacts, you know, water quality, stormwater runoff. They could reduce impervious surface, maintain tree canopy. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can apply these standards. All right, so let me just give you an example of an overlay district, right? So we had talked about overlays as being on top of the existing districts. And so what you can do is add standards. The overlay district would say, you know, all the standards of the underlying district apply, and then you can add more standards. So in 2012, Jericho first did its natural resource inventory. I'll tell you about that, an example in the end of the slideshow. And then by 2017, they were finally ready to use that inventory and apply it to their zoning. And so here, there are several different aspects in this overlay district. It looks at wildlife road crossings. It looks at a portion of the habitat block, the forest block that they call high elevation. It looks at riparian areas, and they set different standards for each of those different criteria, or each of those different components. So this is a really exciting example of how you can use your inventory and bring it into your zoning and then have it cut across other districts. You know, another interesting thing that they did here in Jericho is that they actually held office hours, where a member of the Conservation Commission and the town planner sat in the office, and then concerned landowners could come in as the zoning overlay was being proposed. And the Conservation Commission member would explain to that concerned landowner what resources were present on that parcel. And then the town planner could explain how that proposed overlay might affect that parcel in particular. And so this was an excellent process for helping townspeople to understand the effect that this at the time proposed overlay might have. So there's a lot to say here, but that's a really great example. And there's several good examples of overlay districts across the state applied at a variety of different scales. They're often used for wildlife connectivity or stream, you know, river and stream regulations, water quality regulations, and I've even seen them used for rare, threatened, and endangered species. All right, so I guess I have a little text on the side. Sorry about that. So overall, the benefits of these regulatory strategies are they allow you to implement the town plan. These regulatory strategies have to be in conformance with the town plan. These regulatory strategies can directly address that problem statement that Lincoln started this webinar off with. Is we develop consensus around the problem statement. Well, these regulatory strategies can really directly address a lot of the problems that we're dealing with, and so they could be used to prevent the forest fragmentation. They can control development over time. They can protect some of these highest priority natural resources. And so, there's a lot to say here. Now, it depends on the community. In some towns, regulatory strategies are a non-starter. And in other towns, it's really the first set of tools that they look at. But I think we always want to use a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory strategies. And so thinking about outreach and education as a non-regulatory tool is going to be important whether you're using other non-regulatory tools or whether you're looking at regulatory tools. So there's a lot to say here. Statewide, I think we're capped out at about 83% of Vermont towns have zoning and subdivision, and we haven't seen that change appreciably in the last 2 decades. So a lot of the towns that are going to be using regulatory strategies have already gone there. But I think there's room for more towns to consider that type of approach. Okay, so let's just jump back into that sequence of steps that Lincoln had started us off with. And so we were just at the phase of making this matrix of all of those potential strategies and seeing which one addressed that problem statement, what the costs were, potential partners, all of that stuff. And again, that matrix is super important for helping the town to helping citizens to understand, oh, I looked at all of these options, the Planning Commission looked at all of these options, and here's why we selected the one that we selected. That's particularly important if you're choosing a regulatory strategy. So you're going to choose your suite of tools, and then you're going to prepare for implementation. Okay, so that's where we are in the sequence. We've got one more segment, but I'm just going to pause and say, are there any questions? Feel free to open up your microphone and ask.
Okay, Alan, go ahead.
What is your experience when towns try to have a conservation district or do things like prevent agricultural land fragmentation or development in forest block connectors? I sense that could get to be a testy conversation with landowners, and you're always going to have some people who, frankly, for whatever reason, aren't going to buy into the goal. What happens in those cases? What sort of experiences are you aware of in those cases, and how are they resolved?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and part of it depends on how much work the Conservation and Planning Commission have done to explain the resources to townspeople. I've seen the process really rushed, where a town has gone from inventory really right to regulation. And you're right; those conversations can be pretty testy. I've also seen where towns have done an excellent job of explaining the resources, of explaining why they're important and why they're worthy of protection. And then after that, and after they spent a long time, having event after event after event, explaining those resources and their importance, then moving to the question of regulation. But, at the end of the day, there's a balancing act, right, between the rights of the commons and private property rights. And that's not new. Vermont's motto is freedom and unity, right? Since 1791, we've been trying to come up with this balancing act of the rights of the commons and the rights of the individual. And so you can't have unlimited rights of the individual, because they will impact other people's rights and the commons. And so if everybody can do whatever they want, there's no commons left. And then all of our quality of life gets degraded. And so whether we're talking about forests, if everyone clears their forest, there's no forest left. And so all of those benefits go down. So my point here is that this is nothing new, that it's a balancing act, but with excellent preparation, you can prepare your citizens for a regulatory approach to protecting these resources. So there are all sorts of great case studies out there on towns that have done it well. In the Bolton example I gave, I was really surprised by how little pushback there was. Because the Planning Commission had visited each of those landowners. They already knew it wasn't a big deal because there weren't that many landowners affected. But I've also seen it go pretty sour pretty quickly.
Got a hand up from Patty Davis. Go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, this is a really good topic because we're in the process. Our town plan is due in 2024, and it's not something that we can change the zoning and subdivision regulations in a snap. Everything you guys mentioned is very, very important. And in our town, the opposite is true of Bolton. There are developers that own large tracts of land and have owned these pieces of land for years and have been unsuccessfully trying to develop. And the Planning Commission can, and we're also now involving, like that other town you mentioned, Conservation Committee, all these committees, because the Planning Commission can't keep fighting these huge developers alone. It's really tough. And what makes it harder is because the subdivision and zoning regulations are from 2016, or from the old 8 years, legally we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place until those zoning regs and overlay districts and everything, all the standards are written out in stone, which really isn't due until 2024. So what I'm trying to say is, personally, this is just speaking from me, not the Planning Commission, I try to find things in common when the developers are talking, saying, it sounds like we have the character of the area in common. Can we work from there? And I agree 100% about the one driveway and trying to cluster development to retain the very large area of rural Vermont, of rural Essex, that the rural Essex where I run now, the houses are far between with very long driveways, and it's happening now in Underhill too, by the way, and it's got to stop. So people are moving here. People are moving here from other states because of what you said, the Vermont dream of having a driveway and 40 acres with no one near them. It's tough.
Yeah, I hear you, Patty, and thanks for that. It's also especially tough in Essex. Voters in Essex have really voted against conservation initiatives again and again and again. And I've worked in Essex 3 or 4 times now when they put forward some conservation proposals, and your voters have said no. So you're in a growth area, the larger Burlington area, and the voters, many of them are, as you say, like me, coming from outside of Vermont. And that's not bad or good as far as I'm concerned, but folks might be expecting different services than rural Vermont, and so it's that balancing act. But what I will say is that the town plan is an opportunity to call upon those shared values. And the open space that does exist in Essex is really important for community values, for recreation, as well as resource protection, as well as water quality protection and carbon sequestration and all that. So that town plan rewrite is the opportunity to share those common values with the developers and everybody else.
So even while
So
we're
I'm sorry,
developing
Patty,
it,
we're running low on time. I've got
Okay.
one more section to cover. So I'm
Okay.
just going to charge through that. I apologize, but there'll be time afterwards, and I'm certainly happy to follow up with you. And I have a meeting with Essex in October, early October. So we can talk more.
that's fine. I'll have
Yeah.
Lincoln send me the thing anyway.
Great. All right, I'm just going to keep charging forward, and then we'll have one more break at the end. Thanks. All right. So we're talking about implementation now. All right. So remember, we made that matrix of all of the possible tools, and then we selected a suite of tools. Now, the next step is really to implement that. And I just want to show you this. It's a way of taking a big idea like river corridor protection, right? And breaking that up into pieces. So you have that big idea. Well, we want to do river corridor protection. I don't know about you, my to-do lists are often like, save the world. And that's such a big item. You can't just check that off. So you operationalize that by breaking it up into meaningful tasks. And so for each task, and in this case, we're talking about like stabilize the stream bank. That's one task within this bigger action. You take one task at a time and break it up. And so then for that one task, stabilize the stream bank, you're going to fill out this matrix. Well, why are you doing stream bank stabilization? Well, we want to reduce flood damage. We want to save town dollars, right? Who are the action leaders? We want to assign individuals to work on this task of stabilizing the stream bank. And we're just making this up. It's Paula and Kyla. And then what are the subtasks within that idea of stabilizing the stream bank? Okay, well, first we're going to identify the interested landowners. We're going to figure out what plantings we want to use. We're going to seek donations. We're going to get volunteers. We're going to do before and after photos. Okay, so there's subtasks within this task of stabilizing the stream. We're going to set a timeline for the stream bank stabilization project. We're going to start in January with a goal of finishing in May. We're going to identify a few milestones along the way between January and May. We want to identify the landowners. We want to select the plans. We want to update the select board. We want some newspaper awareness. We want to have the actual planting day, and we want to announce that in Front Porch Forum, etc. Who are the potential, what are potential partners, or what are resources? Where's their capacity? Well, we've got our conservation district, the NRCD, we've got the local nursery, we've got 4-H, right? So this is a way of taking a big idea, river corridor protection, breaking it up into tasks like stabilize the stream bank, and then further break that into subtasks like identifying interested landowners, okay? So here's an example that I wanted to share, that Science to Action project. This started with a $40,000 grant from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. It was between 2011 and 2013. You can see that we did community values mapping across this 4-town area as a way of saying, hey, landowners, what do you care about in these places? And how might those overlap with ecological priorities? So first, we set up a steering committee, and we brought in as many different organizations as we could. The Regional Planning Commission, all 4 of the conservation commissions, the Fish and Wildlife Department, Vermont Natural Resources Council. 2 of the towns had paid planning staff. So we made this large steering committee, and we actually paid for a coordinator for this work. Okay, then we paid for a natural resource inventory. The contractor was Arrowwood Environmental. And so they started their field season in May, but they had worked with the conservation commissions to get permission to do that inventory. We immediately did community value mapping, as I explained what you see on right. So, the first interaction with the public was, hey, what do you care about? What do you love about living in this town? Then we did a lot of outreach. And that was the steering committee did that. The conservation commissions did that. I did a lot of that. And we had a whole walks and talks series as part of that outreach. And so it was fun. We did a float down the Winooski River. We did walks for kids in Jericho. We did a cultural history walk in Richmond. We did a forestry walk at the Audubon Center. Then we did specific technical assistance to each of the planning commissions, and that was the Fish and Wildlife Department and Vermont Natural Resources Council. VNRC actually read each of the town plans and wrote a memo with ideas of what to do. And eventually that led to planning and bylaw changes. And I showed you that, by 2018, town of Jericho had done this amazing overlay district. So it takes time to go from science to action, but it certainly happens. Just a couple notes. I just want to remind you, we need to make this fun. When Bolton was working on its town plan before that zoning rewrite, here's Deb Shelby, who was the chair of the planning commission at the time. The first thing she did for that town plan rewrite was to have a pizza party to invite people to get involved in the planning process. Then the Bolton Planning Commission hosted an art contest. These are sorts of events that people want to attend. It's not just the dry minutia of going line by line through the town plan itself. Okay, another piece of advice here is using the Regional Planning Commission as a resource. And the RPCs are really the premier deliverer of technical assistance and also a data repository. We'll share these examples with you, these resources, the community strategies from VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, is an excellent publication that has a chapter on each of these regulatory and non-regulatory tools. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is going to tell you more about how to use BioFinder, that our statewide inventory for land use planning. And then this is the planning manual from ACCD. Okay, lastly, just want to remind everyone that overwhelmingly hunters and anglers pay for conservation in Vermont through their license fees, but everyone can support conservation through purchasing a habitat stamp or donation to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. All right, sorry I'm a minute over, but wanted to thank you all so much for joining us today. And please don't hesitate to reach out. I've worked with most of the towns on the webinar today, and we'd love to continue to work with you. So thanks so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thanks very much. Good presentation.
Jens?